Hey everyone, welcome to today's edition of One Single Story, where each weekday we offer a brief lesson from a section of today's reading, and then we examine a single relevant question that the passage points us to. Today I'm joined by Sheryl Daughety. We're going to look at a passage from Genesis 44. We're going to spend the week in the book of Genesis, and we're going to talk about the story of Joseph and some insights that we can learn from a righteous man. And so let's jump in. So this is kind of a critical point in the Old Testament narrative, or a critical point when God made a covenant with Abraham. It's important to recognize how the narrative and the Abrahamic promises are moving forward through the life of Joseph. So God promised that he would be a nation out of Abraham's descendants, and had God allowed the descendants of Abraham to multiply in the location where they were living during the time of Jacob, it would have eventually created some issues, okay? So as the family of Abraham would have become larger and larger, they would have become a threat to the surrounding cities. And at some point, it's logical that a large group of people living in an open area would come under attack from local armies and would need to defend themselves. So God had to have a way to protect Abraham's descendants from warfare so that they would grow into a nation. God's ingenious plan was to place his budding nation under the protection of the world superpower of that day, Egypt. By placing the family of Jacob in Egypt, God was able to grow and multiply the descendants of Abraham without the threat that they would be attacked by surrounding cities or nations as they grew larger. In order to accomplish this plan, God chose to allow what seemed to be a great injustice in the life of Joseph, the oldest son of Jacob, by his second wife, Rachel. Through Joseph's sufferings, God was able to place a secret agent, if you will, inside of Egypt, who would be able to pave the way for Jacob's family to come under the umbrella of Egypt's protection. So I want you to think about how all of these events work together so God could fulfill his promise to make a nation out of Abraham. Joseph is mistreated by his brothers. He's then sold as a slave into Egypt. He's falsely accused and sent to prison as a rapist. He has this unique ability to interpret dreams. Then Pharaoh has this dream. Then there's this 7-year famine. And we can see the hand of God working in all of these things, these moving parts, to fulfill this covenant that he has made with Abraham. So as we enter this text, it is kind of the climax of the story of Joseph. In the previous scenes, we've seen how Joseph has moved from family dissension to having a key role in Egypt. But the narrative is not interested in Joseph's success only for the sake of success, okay? The focus of the narrative is to explain how the nation of Israel came to be in the land of Egypt. That's why the story is there. That is the entire purpose of the story. And this part of Joseph's story zeroes in on the perspective, on that perspective. So previously, some things to know is when famine struck the land of Canaan, Jacob sent his sons to buy food from Egypt. And when the brothers come before Joseph, who is now the prince of Egypt, they do not recognize him. However, he is very aware of who they are, and he accuses them of being spies. Joseph decides to keep Simeon in prison until they return and bring their younger brother with them to verify their story. He also returned their money to their grain sacks, which they discovered upon returning home. Although Jacob did not want to allow Benjamin to return with them, when they ran out of grain, it was necessary that they return to Egypt and purchase more. Jacob has no option but to allow Benjamin to go on the journey. And so Joseph releases Simeon upon their arrival, and when he sees his younger brother Benjamin, he is moved to tears and has to rush out of the room. He invites them to a meal of honor and seats the brothers in their proper birth order at the table. He also gives Benjamin larger portions of food right before their own eyes. So as his brothers return home, Joseph takes some mysterious steps that leave all of us wondering what his motives were. So he loads them down with as much grain as they can carry, and he returns their money to their sacks like he did on the first trip. But he also intentionally places his silver cup in the bag of Benjamin. And when they leave to return home, he sends his men to overtake them and perform a search of the grain sacks. They discover the silver cup in Benjamin's bag. So Joseph has framed Benjamin. They are brought back to Egypt, and Joseph demands to keep Benjamin as a servant. Judah pleads with Joseph not to do this for the sake of their father Jacob. So why is it that Joseph did these things? Is he simply testing his brothers, as he says? Is it revenge? Is he getting a little of his own revenge back? Is he trying to teach them a lesson? And if so, what lesson is he trying to teach them? Perhaps seeking to draw on some proper repentance from them. Is he seeking to bring about a more complete fulfillment of his dream that he implied in verse 6? Why is it that he insists on Benjamin coming? So the audience must listen carefully, and then many of these questions are going to be answered later in the week, and some will be clarified in the next chapter. So, Sheryl, sometimes the most interesting way to examine a text is just to ask questions about it. What is here? And even when the answers aren't clear, they certainly provoke this insight to the Word of God. We even can meditate on it. As you've thought about Joseph's motives, what kind of insight have you given maybe to yourself as you've asked some questions?
I wonder if his motives were not to see what the dynamics between his brothers were and what their motives actually were, because this is the same group that decided, hey, we want to get rid of him because we hate him, so we're going to figure out either how to kill him and then sell him or sell him off. So that's what they ended up doing. And he hadn't known them for so long. He hadn't known them since then, that I'm sure he couldn't help but wonder if they wouldn't be willing to do the same thing to Benjamin, because that was Jacob's new favorite, right? Since he thought Joseph was dead. I feel like he was trying to figure out where their hearts were, if they were still the same.
And in the context, Benjamin is his full brother.
Right.
And so he obviously has to give more context to this story, his mother dies in childbirth while he's being born.
And was one of two sisters that Jacob married.
And she was in love. He was deeply in love with Rachel. That's who he wanted to marry. And we talked about that on a previous podcast. Do you think he was setting them up to fail?
I don't think he was. I don't, because, he, having the power that he had, he could have made anything happen in that situation. And I don't think that he was acting in a way that suggested he was trying to get revenge.
This takes place, this whole story takes place over a long period of time. It's not just a few weeks or even really a few years. It takes a long time for him to rise to power and, all of those things that take place. And it really is a dramatic story when you think about, okay, he's the favorite kid. He gets sold into slavery.
It's a crazy story.
He shows up at Potiphar's house. He gets accused of rape, thrown in jail, gains favor with the prison master, interprets some dreams for the king's baker and cupbearer, if I remember right.
That's right.
And then finds his way out by interpreting Pharaoh's dreams. It really is a great movie. But when we're in that movie, all right, let's say when we're Joseph, okay, and if we were honest, we're probably more likely to be his brothers than we are to be Joseph. Right?
Of course, if you're Joseph, you don't have any choice but to be Joseph, right?
That's right.
That's what you got to work with.
But, when you watch a movie or you read a story, you can see the end, right? You know how it turns out. But when you're in the middle of it, when you're his brothers, when you're Joseph, when you're Jacob, or when you're Potiphar or whoever, the jailer, the cupbearer, whoever you are in the story, it is hard to see God's handiwork in those moments. So how can we better identify God's sovereign handiwork in the midst of the drama. And I don't mean that in a bad way, because sometimes I use the word drama and I mean it bad. But the screenplay, if you will, the life that we live, how can we better identify God's handiwork in those moments?
Well, I can imagine for Joseph in particular that he did not feel like most of those situations were, it was probably pretty hard pill for him to swallow that God had purposely put him in some of those situations, because he was completely removed from his family, from his homeland. And then, some of the things you mentioned, I mean, he gets accused of terrible things and then thrown in prison for things that he didn't do. And, I'm sure he felt like he had been forsaken more than he had been anything else. But then I also feel like he had to make the choice, which we also have to make the choice to do, to see the provisions from God during those times. So he didn't get put to death, which
Right.
he very easily could have, with an
Anytime.
accusation like that. Yeah. He continued to have the ability to be trusted by people who had more power than he did and could essentially save him. And I don't think that was with his own power that happened. And surely eventually he realized, no matter what people have tried to do to me, God still continues to provide for me, and he still continues to help me have a way out.
But that's tough to do when you're in the middle of it.
It is.
And we don't, he couldn't even have verbalized then. God was putting them in a place so Israel could grow into a nation of 1,000,000.
Right.
And that's the only place they could do it, is in captivity. How?
Oh, I'm sure he didn't have that big picture.
No, he didn't. He didn't have that big. I don't know that he ever had that view.
Right.
Right. It probably not. We only can see that in hindsight, and we're a long way removed from that historically. And I think having the faith to trust in God, even when we may never see what the fullness of the plan was he was trying to work out, because he didn't. He doesn't see them in slavery. He only sees them living there, right? Because he's in charge. It's only later that we find they become enslaved. I find it hard to see exactly how God's working. It's not that I don't trust him, but man, I would sure like some kind of crystal ball to say, okay, this is how the movie ends.
Don't you think too, though, talking about hindsight, because I totally agree with that, it's much easier to look back and say, well, now I understand what God was doing. But sometimes I feel like it's our job to look back at other situations, not the one that we're in, but the other situations we've had in our lives where we couldn't find hope and we couldn't find purpose and we didn't understand what was going on, but we stepped out of it and then could see, after we had survived it and God had used it,
right,
how he had done that. And I think we have to continually look back and remind ourselves of those things. It's kind of the reasons that God said to the Israelites when this whole situation was over, you have to continue to tell your family. These are stories you have to pass down, because you have to continually remind people. We're so forgetful. And I think that it's our job to remind ourselves of how faithful God's been in our past, how well he's provided for us and loved us and used us. And I think when you're in the middle of a situation, you have to remind yourself of what he's
already done.
Yeah, I think so. I know I do.
Yeah, and just be faithful in that moment. I would agree.
Even when it doesn't make any sense.
I would agree with that too. Well, thank you for joining us today on this edition of One Single Story. We hope you'll be back with us tomorrow as we continue a conversation around the book of Genesis.